think we'll go ahead and get started. About 5 after 5. We want to make sure that we don't run out of time. First things first, welcome to this highlighted session of the Globalization and Education SIG. For the past few years, this SIG has featured a keynote speaker. This year we invited Fazal Rizvi, who is a well-known and prolific scholar on issues related to globalization and education. For those who may not be familiar with Professor Rizvi, he's a professor of education at the University of Melbourne in Australia, where he joined in 2010 after being based at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where he directed the Global Studies in Education program. Along with Professor Bob Lingard, he is the author of a widely read book, Globalizing Education Policy. Today we are excited to have Professor Rizvi here with us for his presentation entitled Possibilities of a Post-Globalization Educational Policyscape. Since initially proposing this session, Professor Rizvi has developed a paper with the title Globalization and Education After Trump and Brexit. Following his remarks, we will hear a few words from Dr. Mario Novelli, who is Professor of Political Economy at the University of Sussex in the UK. We are grateful to Professor Novelli for accepting our invitation to serve as discussant. He brings a critical perspective to the issues of globalization and is known for insightful and challenging questions. However, before we pass the mic to Professor Rizvi, we want to take this opportunity to recognize the winners of the 2016 Book Award for the Globalization and Education SIG. And to do that, I would like to ask one of the members of the Book Award Committee to come up, Professor Gustavo Fishman.
Good afternoon. For those that don't know, today we are on strike. And Barcelona won 6-1, so this is a really important thing. So congratulations to all of you. Okay, so a few words on behalf of the Book Award Committee for the Globalization and Education SIG, whose members were myself, Robin Shields, Francine Menashi, and Rolf Straubhardt. Rolf was the chair, and really he did a wonderful job chairing the committee, and I don't know if Francine and Robin are here, but hello. It was a hard committee because there were 12 books, all of them of high quality, many of them deserving to be recognized, but we just choose two because they were significantly relevant, and it was an easy agreement, but it was hard to distinguish between the 12. But once we selected these two, we were very happy. So we decided on an honorable mention for the book of Catherine Heinemann that is entitled The Orderly Entrepreneur, Youth Education and Government in Rwanda. Really wonderful book. Please go to the bookstores and order by Amazon, buy it. And Catherine is here, and this is the book. Please, let's recognize her work. The committee decided that the book is an excellent example of an accessible ethnography, one that tells in detail, a detailed and engaging story, which while also connecting the story to established bodies of theory and larger global trends. We were particularly impressed with how Catherine wrote this book in a way that could be read and understood by a lay audience as well as an academic one. Congratulations, Catherine, for an excellent book. And for the winner is a book written by Tony Berger, Clara Fontdevila, and Adrián Sancajo. Tony's here, and Clara also, and Javier, no, okay. And the title of the book, as you can see, is The Privatization of Education, a Political Economy of Global Education Reform. The committee was struck by how this book cogently and comprehensively tackles one of the most pressing topics in education today, privatization, and does so with a robust theorization of a problem on a global scale. given that it is clear aid and theoretically rich contribution to the larger debate on privatization and education in the context of global education reform. It is an excellent text for coursework in globalization and education, privatization and education reform, and also a wonderful reference text for scholars on these subjects. We encourage you to read and share this book, and please congratulations to Tony, Clara, Adrian, and Catherine. And Tony is coming here to say a few words.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you to everyone. It's just a few words to say well, thank you, that this is a big honor to receive this award, because it's coming from the academic community that we respect and we admire the most, that is CIES, and in particular this SIG on globalization and education. Of course, this means a lot for us, Clara, Adrian, and myself. Adrian couldn't be here today. He's in CIES, but he's finishing the conclusions of his PhD that he's supposed to submit tomorrow. So, but as I said, this is a very impressive achievement for us at the personal level, but it's also, I think, that a very positive award in the sense that it encourages to do a type of research that we see that is ambitious in the scope, that it tries to talk about education reform at a global level. In some conferences where we presented the preliminary results of this project that became this book, we got some questions like trying to challenge, like, how come can you talk about global education reforms in so different contexts? And well, I think that the response is like two-sided, or we have two responses to this. The first, at the methodological level, we benefited a lot and we learned a lot from the methodology of the systematic literature review, that it allows to generate new knowledge from already existing case studies. So I think that this methodology was very important for us when it comes to produce this book without having to produce primary data at the country level. And of course, there's a second answer to this question. We also benefited a lot from the advice and the feedback from experts, colleagues, and mentors in comparative education, that they gave us a lot of feedback during the process of the review, not only when it comes to give feedback to the results of the different chapters, but also to trying to help us to identify some gaps in the literature that we were not covering yet. I would like to refer to some of these people because they are well known in CIES by alphabetic order. They are Frank Adamson, Stephen Ball, Nina Basha, Xavier Bonal, Brent Edwards, Bob Lingard, Christopher Lubienski, Susan Robertson, and Prachi Srivastava. Thank you to all of them for the support during all the process. Thanks also to a Marie Curie grant and to Education International for their support to the research behind the book, and in particular to Nicola Wachter and Martin Henry, that are in the Research Institute of Education International, and other colleagues that were also there before, Felisa Tivitz and Mireille de Koning, for also the support, intellectual and also economic support to this project. And finally, thanks to Gita Steiner-Hamshi for accepting our book in the book series she coordinates in Teachers College Press called International Perspectives on Educational Reform. Also, finally, just say that we also wanted this book to be open access, and if you Google the title, I guess that you will find it very, very easily, so you can download it, and if you really like it, you also can buy it. And thank you very much.
Writing any book is no small endeavor. Writing books that are of particularly high quality is something that we want to show our appreciation for. So briefly, if we could have the authors come up to the stage, I have a small token for you. So please come up, Catherine and Clara. Adrian, you have to take Adrian. Okay. So, yes, thank just have a round of applause? All right, and sorry for the delay. Now I would like to welcome Professor Fazal Rizvi to deliver the keynote.
Thank you. Okay. The winner is La La Land. No. No, it's Tony Berger. That was a silly American joke. At this conference, there is an elephant in the room, sitting at the table, and yet it is in everyone's mind, but is not being talked about, okay, in an explicit fashion. But in conversations that I have encountered in the corridors and in the coffee shops, it's quite ubiquitous. And that elephant is Trump, okay? And I want to actually say something about why it is that I think it's important to talk about the Trump circus, which has actually taken up huge amount of my time over the last year. I think I calculated on the average I spend something like an hour and a half every day thinking, looking at the websites, reading about various newspapers. It has kind of consumed me. At one level, it might sound as frivolous and as wasting of time, but I think there is something very important that's happening that we should actually analyze a little more carefully using all the theoretical resources that our disciplinary practices give us. And that's why I thought that I would speak quite explicitly about what it means for the Trump victory, means for the changing nature of our field, and the kind of questions that it is raising for us that we cannot actually ignore and have to take a position on, and that if there is any kind of interesting new insights that we can develop from our analysis, then the field would be better for it. Of course, countless number of words have been written over the past year in an attempt to understand the electoral victory of Donald Trump and the Brexit vote, as well as the rise of an aggressive nationalism in mainland Europe and around the world, including Japan, as Kyoto pointed out, and India, as Sangeeta pointed out the other day. Most of these commentaries, both academic and popular, in the United States and Britain have focused on the idea of globalization and how these political shifts we have witnessed over the past few years represent a backlash against various forms and effects of globalization. There is indeed no denying that discontents around globalization have become widespread and widely recognized. Various aspects of globalizations have been shown to have not delivered on the kind of promises that were made merely three decades ago. Economically, it has been noted that globalization has benefited a very few minority of people, while a large majority have had their lives dispersed, disrupted, and even destroyed. Economic globalization has led to unsustainable and unacceptable levels of inequality. Politically, it has been suggested that the New World Order that globalization has spawned has left power in the hands of a very small transnational elite, squeezing out the democratic voices of most of the citizenry, not only in the United States, but around the world. It has led to a democratic deficit in that sense. And culturally, deeply held values and traditions have been upended, especially as a result of growing levels of migration and cultural exchange across national boundaries, so it has been argued. Now, these discontents, to my mind, have raised a number of very important questions about globalization and its future. Are these discontents even justified, we need to ask, or are they simply manufactured and exploited by expedient politicians? To what extent are the globalization sentiments new, and what kind of threat do they pose to the existing liberal economic and political order forged after the Second World War? Why should this be a matter of concern to anybody? And indeed, should we not celebrate the demise of globalization? Are we entering a new period of history in which nation states will once again become dominant and perhaps even more strident and aggressive within their borders and across their borders? Is it possible to stop the global flows of people without severely damaging an economy that is now increasingly based on knowledge and cultural exchange, especially the services economy? Are we not already so interconnected and interdependent that ethno-nationalist sentiments belong to another era and are either obsolete or dangerous or indeed both? Are the populist solutions pursued in recent years addressing the discontents of globalization even realistic, especially those that have been proposed by the populist movement representing Brexit and Trump? Do they have the capacity to create a set of conditions in which higher level of economic growth on the one hand and equality and democracy on the other hand even possible? Or are the contradictions of their proposals so great that they are likely to exasperate equality and democracy? These are really quite significant questions for education and educational thinking generally, but to comparative education and international education in particular, for that they hold out the possibility that the comparative may need to be yet again rethought, and indeed the international part of comparative and international might also need to be rethought. International in terms of what? For there is now a particular view that international has begun to be defined under the regimes of globalization. Do we need to think about international in new ways becomes a fairly significant question for our field, for this association, and indeed for our intellectual work. Now, over the past 3 years, systems of education have become increasingly interconnected. They have put a premium on sharing of information, ideas and ideologies, as well as on borrowing of policies and developing them jointly in various regional and international fora. International assessment and accountability technologies have been developed through which performance of national systems are now judged, compared, benchmarked against supposedly common standards. Global mobility of students has become a commonplace phenomenon, creating an industry upon which the financial sustainability of many institutions, especially at the level of higher education, is now inextricably dependent. These developments display a distinctive trend towards convergence. Some 10 years ago, my friend and colleague Stephen Carney coined the phrase educational policy-scapes to show how an understanding of nation states and system study of education, to quote, must be informed by understandings of the nature of globalization, and especially the new imaginative regimes that it makes possible. Now, given their commitment to rearrange the world, the Trump victory and Brexit have the potential to destabilize the educational policy-scapes that exist currently. So we need to ask, what kind of policy-scapes are we likely to see in the future? And what are the alternatives that are available to us? Can we imagine a kind of policy-scape that does not leave out attention to the global flows of ideas, capital, and indeed, but arranges them differently than the rationality of neoliberalism suggests? In other words, we need to ask new kind of questions about flows and the scapes that Stephen has written about. Now we know that the political left has come up with a whole range of criticisms of globalization, both its logic and its consequences. It has repeatedly been shown that neoliberal processes of globalization are undemocratic and result in uneven and unequal outcomes. In this talk, I want to argue that Trump and Brexiteers have largely embraced the leftist critiques, paradoxical though it might sound. But they have bolted onto that critique a ethno-nationalist politics. And I think it's the notion of bolting on that I want to pay attention to. How has it been possible for a set of neoliberal ideas to be embraced and perhaps even doubled down on, along with an ethno-nationalist politics? We need to figure out this black box of bolting on and how that has been done. So what has happened is it is possible to say that the success of Trump and to a lesser extent Brexit lies in tying the legitimate concerns of that people legitimately have, that their inequality, that of their economic insecurity, to cultural issues. In other words, the cultural and the economic have been joined together in a fashion that Marxists did in a particular way, but now we might be witnessing being done in a very different ways. In other words, there are a whole range of issues that this bolting on is giving rise to. Now, this line of thinking, of bolting on, this way of thinking, has obscured how it is the economic shifts and public policies associated with neoliberal rationality that has played a more decisive role in producing social inequalities and insecurities. Yet both Trump administration and post-Brexit Britain have doubled down on neoliberal rationality in a whole range of ways that are now becoming quite evident, and I will talk about that very shortly. Now, I want to argue that this has produced a political terrain that is deeply, deeply contradictory. And as is the case with most contradictions, it provided fizzes and gaps in which progressive possibilities may lie. And in my view, the new politics that has emerged will indeed find it difficult to reconcile its continuing adherence to neoliberal rationality and its attraction and its appeal towards ethno-nationalism. Those two things are difficult to reconcile in an era of globalization. And yet, the efforts are going to be made to reconcile them. And much of the trouble that might arise may come in the attempts to bolt on. And I think that's the thing that we need to pay the most attention on. Now, for more than 3 decades, scholars and activists on the political left have shown how globalization of economic activities has had negative effects on marginalized communities, both within and across the nations. Whilst in some countries, such as China and Korea, globalization has arguably created new opportunities. In others, it has exacerbated various types of social stratification, including with respect to class, gender, race, religion, age, and the urban-rural divide. Even in those countries that have benefited from globalization, gaps in people's life chances have widened. In China and in many parts of Asia, their global cities, their shining cities, have enabled some to enjoy the lifestyles of the advanced economies, while in rural areas, the benefits of globalization have been scarce, if not entirely absent. The stories of suicides amongst farmers in India, for example, have now become legendary. So while in Europe and the United States, many believe that the process of globalization have led to the export of their jobs and wealth to Asia, within Asia, the picture is starkly much more complex and uneven. In Europe and in the United States, the industrial cities have had to carry much of the burden of global economic transformations. the combined forces of technologization of work and globalization of production have reduced the availability of employ that was once plentiful. Employment rates have soared, forcing people to move to find new jobs. People have had to train for these jobs, and yet the privatization regimes have made sure that this training is provided at cost to the people themselves. Okay? They have had to make investment that many indeed cannot afford. At the same time, the welfare provisions have been cut, as governments have either not been able to afford them, or have an ideological objection to them. They have assumed that state subsidies and programs frequently encourage inefficiencies and make people dependent on handouts. There has been a relentless ideological campaign that has celebrated the logic of the markets, suggesting that the individuals should be responsible for themselves and their own lives and their own futures, no matter how disrupted they are by forces outside their control. While most people's capacity to enjoy the various benefits of globalization, like the availability of vast array of consumer goods, has declined, they are constantly subjected to lifestyle choices that are often beyond their grasp. We need to better understand the logic of consumption. The mass advertising campaigns are designed to elicit desire for goods and services that only few can access. There's clearly a growing gap between those who can afford the cosmopolitan tastes and those who are left to simply fantasize about them. As Zygmunt Bauman, in his very famous article, Tourist and Vagabond, pointed out, globalization has given rise to new forms of social differentiations around what he called consumptive desires, between those who can realize these desires and those who are left outside the gates wishing that they could, often with accompanying anger and envy. This qualitative account of social inequality, of course, parallels the quantitative accounts, such as that provided by Piketty in recent years, with global levels of wealth and inequality, income inequality under the conditions of globalization, but even before that, shown to be growing. While what both quantitative and qualitative analysis indicate is that economic inequalities have always had cultural dimensions and political outcomes. The Trump and Brexit campaigns have tried to put another spin on that connection. Indeed, Guy Standing has probably done much more work in trying to understand this relationship and has elaborated the nature of these political outcomes of globalization of economy in and through cultural formations of various kinds. He refers to a class of people badly affected by the processes of globalization as the Precariat. If you haven't read that book, it is well worth having a look at. It's polemical and easy to read. The emerging Precariat class, Standing argues, his book came out in 2010, is a heterogeneous group, an amalgamation of several different social groups that include young educated people and those who have fallen out of the old-style industrial working class. The Precariat is, however, not only suffering from job insecurity, but have also got a whole range of cultural concerns about their identity. They feel that recent public policies have diminished the cultural advantages in the economic space that they once enjoyed, and that they have lost democratic control over the destinies that they had assumed they once had, which has been transferred onto people who have been able to make noises around identity politics. Well before Trump and Brexit, Standing had warned that this group was politically volatile and dangerous, not only because it was internally divided, but also because its members are susceptible to the siren calls of political extremism, including the ideologies promoted by the politically expedient politicians who were not reluctant to stoke fears by creating a cultural chasm within the marginalized and disadvantaged communities. Thus, we have witnessed in recent years the villainization of migrants, of refugees, of indigenous people, and other vulnerable groups. The standings Precariat are convinced that their cultural and political loss of their political and cultural voice is largely due to globalization, which has undermined the conventional democratic institutions in their view, especially as power has shifted from national self-determination to global institutions. Their assumption is that supra-state agencies and regimes, both global and regional, like EU, have created substantial democratic deficits for them, okay, as the political authority of nation has undermined. The global markets, global communication systems, and the incipient global civil society, they're convinced, has weakened their state, not anyone's state, their state. The main beneficiaries of these developments have been, in their view, have been the transnational elite, for whom greater space is now available for cultural enjoyments and democratic activity outside the public governance institutions. According to William Robinson, for example, as stakeholders and globally mobile people, the transnational elite control the operations of the emerging global institutions and communication systems and are able to steer the state in their favor. Now, some of these accounts of globalization and its discontents are not new. Earlier on, in a very widely read book, Globalization, Jean Soholte showed how globalization led to three forms of INS, I-N with a bracket, insecurity, inequality, and undemocracy. In other words, security, not only ecological, economic, cultural, and psychological, but also of other kinds. Inequality of various kinds, as well as undemocracy. Manfred Steger, in his little book, has also shown globalization benefits to be unevenly and unequally distributed. Around the turn of the century, no less than 3 books emerged with the title Globalization and its Discontents, one by Joseph Stiglitz, one by Saskia Sassen, and one by an author whose name I forget, deliberately. Each of these books suggests that global processes and their current forms were unsustainable, and sooner or later they will create conditions of considerable political volatility. And I think their predictions are coming to show themselves to be true. In response, Sassen proposed a set of radical alternatives to global capitalism, such as, many of them, advocated by the Occupy movement. Stiglitz, on the other hand, presented a very different way forward, emphasizing the need to reform international agencies such as the World Bank, not surprisingly, and IMF, and a greater responsibility of the nation states to protect the vulnerable. Now, these criticisms are familiar enough to all of us. In ways that might appear somewhat ironic, political movements around Brexit and Trump have largely embraced most of these criticisms of globalization that the political left had advanced. They've accepted, for example, that globalization has produced unacceptable levels of social inequality, that its practices are fundamentally undemocratic and have led to various insecurities. They're critical of the ways in which globalization has destabilized communities, labor markets, and national norms. They're mournful of the jobs that no longer exist and of declining economic opportunities and prospects. They have questioned the political legitimacy of supra and regional agencies such as European Union, especially what they regard as their overstretch into aspects of life that they believe are best handled either at the local or the national or indeed at the individual level. In other words, their individualism is assumed to be threatened. They have assumed that the New World Order is to be inherently unfavorable to their interests and have demanded a New Deal in which global trade is in national rather than corporate interest. Now, as compelling as these concerns are, both Trump and Brexiteer, however, bolted on, the term that I've used before, onto a new politics, new cultural politics of ethno-nationalism. They have captured and exploited the rhetoric of those who are suspicious of global migration and have decided to hold the migrants themselves responsible for many of the infliction of the economically vulnerable people across the communities. They consider the ease with which people are supposedly able to move across national borders to be a major threat to their job prospects and the kind of good life they imagine they once had. They argue that globalization has undermined their cultural and religious tradition and is forcing them to accept the values of diversity and cultural exchange and against the wishes against their wishes and their interests. They're fearful of cultural heterogeneity, even if the numbers of immigrants and refugees in their communities is relatively small, as pointed out in Apudharai's book, Fear of Small Numbers. Their fear is of the cultural other, whose demand for rights and privileges that many of us in CIES make, they are afraid might compete with their. In other words, a situation of competition has been set up in relation to the rights and privileges, arising out of very different set of considerations. One of them national and privileged origin, and the other one of human rights of a generalized kind. Of course, many of these fears are unfounded. The success Trump and Brexiteers have, however, had is in capturing these fears into a relatively persuasive narrative to which a large proportion of their electorates can relate. In this way, the Trump victory and Brexit represent a story of political mobilization. And I think we need to understand better political mobilization, successfully converted into a populist movement. Now, populist movements are, of course, as old as politics itself. They can be both right-wing and left-wing, but only some reach a critical mass of power, while others remain on the sidelines. Populism is best viewed as a political strategy to mobilize people around a loosely connected set of ideas. Now, loosely connected set of ideas is an important phrase there. There is no claim to coherence. There is simply a claim to something that is linked to sentiments and feelings. It is not constituted by a coherent set of concepts, but various discursive assemblages that are grounded in affect and emotions and are often based on a sharp differentiation between us and them, our feelings and their feelings. A loose and shared characterization of enemy is often also necessary for populism to get political purpose, as is a state of victimhood requiring the construction of an exploitative elite who is in control and who needs to be fought against. Thus, the populist rhetoric surrounding the Trump victory and Brexit has tentative threads that are lumped together into an ideologically convenient fashion, not an ideologically coherent fashion, ideologically convenient fashion, without any serious attempt to ensure coherence across its claims. These threads include a complaint about global rules of trade and how it had allegedly disadvantaged Americans and the British ahead of others who have benefited from it. Allied to this is the assumption that national authority and power has shifted to global institutions. It is assumed that these transformations, this transfer, has adversely affected us, the American and the British industries, the workers, who other countries have been able to take advantage of them. And because their leaders have displayed inaptitude in negotiating better deals, okay, inaptitude in better deals. So a claim about inaptitude is fairly central to their logic. It is asserted that global corporations and managers are the most direct beneficiary of the political weaknesses of our leaders at the national level, and they have been able to dupe and transcend the weaker entities such as us. In other words, you hold yourself to become a victim of the follies that are not necessarily done by others, but they're also done by us to ourselves, and hence the political mobilization. Along with this focus on the effects of global trade, the populism of both populism of Trump, for example, has been highly successful in linking economic anxieties to cultural concerns, therefore. It is suggested that global economy has enabled unfettered flows of not only capital, but also people across national boundaries. A discourse of losing control over our borders has become a rallying cry, as prejudices against immigrants and refugees have intensified. In America, it is assumed that jobs are being lost to the cultural others. They're not only being lost, but they're being lost to somebody, you know. It's not simply a loss, it's a loss to somebody, okay, either within the nation or elsewhere. And that they can only come back if the global flows of people are more rigorously controlled, or better still, stopped altogether. At the same time, a powerful narrative of national security has emerged in which Islam and Muslims are assumed to be the major culprits. Despite their small numbers, other minorities too are assumed to have the potential to dilute local cultural and religious traditions, with Anglo-American values becoming undermined by a globally homogenizing culture on the one hand, and unjustifiable tolerance of foreign cultural practices on the other. That is, we have taken tolerance too far, underpinned by the ideologies of diversity and multiculturalism, and that globalization has promoted, supposedly. Now, this populism thus ties issues of economic decline to a set of cultural factors in a way that appears seamless to its supporters anyway. It presents a most diffuse and often contradictory account of discontents. Its success lies in its capacity to bring together under one ideological umbrella a range of often conflicting ideas. It thus seemingly managed to satisfy a diversity of political interests and cultural prejudices, from the overtly xenophobic sentiments to economically nationalist sentiments. What it does not do, however, is consider in any serious way the main tenets of neoliberalism that have arguably contributed more to economic distress of the precariat than the cultural concerns. In other words, there has been an absence of analysis as well as foregrounding of analysis. And that is deliberate, as I will show very shortly. The injustices of globalization are thus assumed to be inherent in the global flows of people and not necessarily global flows of capital. The excesses of global institutions and in transnational elite, rather than in the neoliberal approaches to the new geography, new scalar logic, if you like. The failures of the nation state are assumed, moreover, to lie in not getting a favorable deal in trade, rather than in the contradictions inherent in the system of trading that World Trade Organization, for example, represents. In this way, the populist rhetoric of Trump masks the fact that global interconnectivity may not be the problem afflicting the American precariat as such, but the neoliberal terms in which interconnectivity is defined and enacted. Connectivity is not the problem, but the ways in which it's defined. Trump is a devotee, of course, as we know, of the main creed of neoliberalism, and in particular, its assumptions regarding the ways in which societies and their institutions are best organized and governed. He continues to stress the importance of free markets, finding their policy expressions in the ideas of deregulation of industries and capital flows, the radical reduction in welfare state provisions, and the privatizing of private goods and services. He assumes human beings to be largely motivated by, as indeed he is, to economic self-interest. In other words, he's projecting himself onto others, always seeking to strengthen their competitive advantage within the markets. Trump arguments are thus located in a system of thought, a distinctive mode of reason that assumes what Wendy Brown, in a wonderful book that she wrote 2 years ago, refers to as economization of subjects. The neoliberal rationality imagines that economics can remake other fields of existence in and through its norms, its terms, and its matrices. In this logic, human beings are figured as human capital across all spheres of life, including education. This line of thinking is consistent with my own work with Bob Lingard on neoliberal imaginary, through which people try to make sense of their identity and their social relations. As an imaginary, neoliberalism suggests both the ways in which we need to interpret the world, imagine the ways in which, and imagine the ways in which it should be. In other words, the normative and the descriptive are fused together. As Brown puts it, within neoliberal rationality, human capital is both our is and our ought, what we are said to be, what we should be, and what the rationality makes us into through its norms, through its construction of its environments. What Trump and his supporters refuse to see, however, is that these norms are blind to the social outcomes that it has directly produced in entrenching economic inequality. When everywhere and when everyone and everything and everywhere is defined in terms of capital investment and appreciation, the notion of public good necessarily loses its significance. Everyone, including the government, is no longer identified with the public, but is increasingly viewed as merely another economic actor amongst many others. As economic actors, corporations feel obliged to work with their shareholders rather than for the community at large. They demand greater tax breaks so that they can compete in the market more effectively and efficiently. It is not in their interest to agree to minimum wage, for example, because such egalitarian measures invariably disadvantage them in the market and invariably cut into their profits that they're expected to make for their shareholders. Now, if this is so, then social inequality and discontent are outcome of unequal distribution of wealth within nation state and its public policies, rather than global processes and global interconnectivity as such. As Jack Ma, the owner of Alibaba, one of the world's largest companies, said in January at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, that contrary to the popular view, the United States has benefited disproportionately from globalization of trade in industries such as telecommunications, tourism, and retail services. But, he argues, it has not used its profits wisely, preferring to spend it on military misadventures and giving tax cuts to the rich instead of looking after the dislocated members of its society, dislocated because of globalization. The problem, he has noted, is not globalization of trade, but the failure of the United States to pursue policies that are more redistributive, preferring policies that are punitive and uncaring. Jack Ma's analysis, although he comes from a different world view than mine, is nonetheless underlies the very complicated relationship between globalization on the one hand and neoliberalism on the other. In other words, there is a hyphen between neoliberal globalization, and we need to actually understand not only neoliberal and globalization, but also the hyphen. Okay, that to me is fairly important way to. This complication, this difficult kind of relationship, is further evident in the realization that neoliberalism is in fact a product of Anglo-American political priorities and political preferences. The neoliberal definition of globalization, the hyphenation that I've talked about, is an outcome of the American post-war efforts to remake the world in its own image, through Marshall Plan and all those sort of things. Indeed, it is the United States, far more than any other country, that has had the decisive voice in determining the content of the policies and procedures that have accompanied neoliberal globalization. Its say remains dominant in multilateral organizations such as the World Bank, the OECD, IMF, and it has played a powerful role in shaping the content of the rules of the World Trade Organization, which now seeks to enforce much to the chagrin of Trump and his supporters. In other words, having made the rule, United States says that those rules were not fair to us, and they need to be even fairer than they are already in terms of the benefits. Now, similarly, United Kingdom was not a bystander in forging the Schengen Agreement, not a bystander that encouraged the mobility of people without visa across countries within the European Union in the Schengen area, not European Union, broader than that, largely on the basis of its earlier conviction that the mobility of people and capital across Europe was fundamental to its economic growth, its economic productivity and prosperity. In other words, they have changed their mind about Schengen. If these arguments are valid, then ethno-nationalism promoted by both Trump and Brexit is in fact a ruse, masking the contradictions of neoliberal rationality, as well as its impact on the life chances of the marginalized. What is clear is that unless progressive redistributive policies are introduced within the United States, no attempt by Trump administration at reordering the nation's cultural politics can be productive in improving the economic prospects of its citizens for a better life. Holding immigrants and refugees responsible for unemployment and deteriorating labor conditions and fueling the fires of Islamophobia may play well with certain sections of American and British societies, but they're unlikely to lead to either economic productivity or to social cohesion and community harmony that are so fundamental to ensuring capital accumulation and financial stability, as Roger and I discussed had pointed out some 30 years ago. Improvements in the working conditions of people cannot occur by blaming globalization as such, but attending to the contradictions and the definitions of globalization and the neoliberal rationality within the terms of which its hegemonic conception is currently defined. And yet, far from recognizing the problems associated with it, the Trump administration has doubled down, which is an American phrase, not used in Australia all that much, but doubled down on the assumption of neoliberal rationality. It has promised to cut taxes in unprecedented ways. In all likelihood, it will attempt to balance the budget by cutting back on expenditure on social programs insofar as it can. It has indicated a determination to stimulate the economy by an expansive program of deregulation and privatization. Trump has appointed a cabinet that is wedded to the interests of the big end of town, or to a more ideologically rigid form of capitalism, if you like. Some members of the Trump cabinet are hostile to the goals of the very agencies they've been asked to oversee, as well as to the various forms of unionization. The idea of minimum wage has effectively been ruled out at the federal level. In short, the Trump administration is displaying a strong commitment to neoliberal, and perhaps even stronger commitment to neoliberal rationality than the Obama and earlier regimes, applied initially to the operations of the state, but then extended to the renegotiation of treaties and international trade. Though in ways not as muscular, the British government too is similarly committed to the application of neoliberal principles to state policies and practices. Even it has decided, as it has decided to go it alone outside the purview of the European Union. In education, the Trump commitment to neoliberal rationality could not be clearer with the appointment as his Secretary of State, Betty DeVos, one of the most ideologically driven in recent history, with no experience in running a public system or a state university and shaping statewide education policy. Her signature issue, school voucher, is based on her commitment to a free market ideology in education. She argues, and I quote, "Let the education dollars flow the child instead of forcing the child to flow the dollars. People deserve choices and options, and we know about $20 billion that has been allocated to pursue that policy." As a former chairwoman of the Republican Party in Michigan and a major donor to the party. She has supported various policies and programs of voucher, privatization, and deregulation charter schools. DeVos argues the charter schools invariably improve the quality of provisions and represent a way of providing greater access to educational opportunity to the marginalized and poorer communities. In other words, she does have a view of equity defined in terms of access for those who can afford it. Neither of these claims is supported by evidence, however. A recent review of research on meta-review of research on public-funded private school in the United States indicates no clear advantage or improvement in academic achievement among students attending private schools. According to Chris and Sarah Lubinsky, the evidence about charter school effectiveness is equally mixed. More disturbing is the finding that private schools are more economically and racially segregated than public schools, and that they underrepresent students with special needs. Furthermore, poorly funded schools are less likely to provide access to new technologies, science laboratories, secure environments, and so on and so on. In the end, they exasperate cultural tensions as well as social inequalities, perpetuating social conflict, social division, social segregation, without doing anything to minimize level of economic inequalities and despair. In his book, my friend David Hirsch, The End of Public School, the book's title, has shown how privatization policies also undermine democracy. He argues that public schools were created as learning communities that supported the development of trusting and caring relationships, the very opposite of the world of competition and deals that Trump and his supporters committed to. Yet in schools where students are viewed as customers and parents as shareholders, this democratic function of education is necessarily diluted as students are prepared for a world of competition. In the end, the idea of privatization, grounded in neoliberal rationality, projects a different view of society, as our award-winning book suggests, as shown, in which individuals are encouraged to compete for scarce resources and in which the market defines modes of social relationship. The ideas of democracy and equality are not abandoned, but are re-articulated in market terms. The concept of democracy becomes largely representative rather than participatory, symbolic rather than substantive, while equality is redefined in terms of entitlement, suggesting that individuals deserve what they have earned rather than what they might share. This, of course, really points to the conditions for social tension that is partly is supposed to be expressed in Trump victory, but is likely to make it much more extensive and much more wide-ranging. It's hard to see how the doubling down on neoliberal rationality can bring any benefits to the precariat class in the United States or indeed in Britain. Nor is it clear how their decision to go it alone and put nation first, likely in the long run, to be productive. In education policy making in the United States has seldom been keen to draw on elsewhere, as it has not been reluctant to promote its vision of education throughout the world through development aid programs and its active guidance of global agencies such as the OECD. Trump's national agenda is unlikely to change this to any great extent. And since, as a strong state, his promise to go it alone has an appeal for his supporters. However, what his prescription for others is likely to be much more dangerous. The consequences of Brexit, however, are more serious and more direct for educational institutions in the UK, as Susan Robertson and others have pointed out. The support they receive, the support that Britain receives for academic and student mobility and exchange programs from EU are likely to be severely diminished, as indeed might the funding for programs of collaborative research. It will also lose an important forum in which educational ideas are explored and debated, and programs of educational reform compared and benchmarked. The financial benefits it derives from international students in its universities will also decline. The question arises then what kind of policy scape might emerge in United States and Britain against these political conditions and against this particular view of the contradictions that I have defined, in which neoliberal assumptions are doubled down on. But they have not abandoned globalization, but at the same time have embraced ethno-nationalism. So ethno-nationalism, some idea of global intervention, not entirely abandoned, as well as neoliberal assumptions together forge a very, very toxic mix indeed. Certainly it's possible for US and UK to promote a more rigorous nationalist regimes and close their borders to refugees and migrants who do not serve their immediate interests. And this appears, of course, likely. Also possible is to imagine further restrictions on flows of goods and services, perhaps also, although less likely, capital. In education, it's possible to imagine a United States in which its traditional commitment to multiculturalism, human rights education, internationalization, and so on might be wound back, promoting instead a curriculum that underlines the importance of religious and patriotic values. Indeed, DeVos has already indicated her interest in encouraging schools, both private and public, to return to these Judeo-Christian traditions. Other countries might be required to follow these trends. Yet it's hard to imagine educational institutions anywhere turning their backs on an era of nation states once again, separating themselves from global forces and opportunities. There are some aspects of global interconnectivity that now appear ontologically fixed. Developments in information and technologies are not going away, for example, which have rendered inevitable the global flows of ideas, ideologies, and images. They have intensified transnational connectedness and awareness of such intensification. They have disembedded social relations from local context and interactions, leading to accelerated change through time-space compression. Most communities have already become transformed through the global flows of people. Cultural diversity, exchange, and hybridity have become a fact of life in both the United States and Britain, and cannot simply be wished away. These things are grounded in our communities, and it's much more difficult to pull back from them than is often assumed. The new economies are increasingly centered on services economies, such industries as tourism, education, retail, and these are predicated fundamentally now on globalized exchange. Australia's economy is 70% services. 80% of that 70% is in terms of global exchange of one kind, including education, including tourism, and so on. So in other words, global exchange has become part and parcel of the composition of our economies. And I think that needs to be recognized. The transfer from goods to services industries has been significant, but I think its cultural significance is often under-recognized. At the same time, there is now a deep awareness amongst the young, in particular, that many of the serious problems facing humanity, such as the environment, are global, requiring capital. In other words, there are reasons to be pessimistic, but there are also reasons to realize that there are grounded conditions, there are ontological realities that will be difficult to bound back from. These historical, ontological realities, I want to say, make it difficult to imagine a world without global interconnectivity and continuing exchange. Many aspects of globalization are here to stay. The idea of post-globalization, therefore, appears to be something of a mirage. The issue now is not whether there will be some aspects of global interconnectivity, but how these might be defined. In other words, how the terms of our global interdependence and our global interconnectivity might be couched. This, to my mind, is conceptual and political, but also most fundamentally a moral question. Okay, as we have noted over the past few decades, the terms of the global economic, political, and cultural exchange have been framed in neoliberal terms. Neoliberal terms prescribes a morality as well as it prescribes an economic. In other words, it prescribes the way human beings should relate to each other. That suggests to me that we need to actually be careful not to abandon moral discourse and really not look at the moral concerns of our field and not simply its conceptual and its empirical aspects. Globalization has not only been about material structures of power, but it's also constituted and it has also constituted and is constituted by a particular way of interpreting and representing the world, a particular way of forming and forging the social of the social exchange. And in particular, in that sense, it involves representing the world. In short, a common sense. As Stuart Hall pointed out many years ago, one of the unexpected benefits of Trump victory and Brexit might be that they have served to unmask the common sense generated by neoliberal rationality. They have shown how the benefits of neoliberal globalization have been unevenly distributed and how it has disempowered communities. They have pointed to the new need to develop a new common sense. Where might this common sense come from? That is the question that we need to ask, and that our field should set itself the challenge of working on. While such a common sense cannot simply abandon globalization, the ontological realities the neoliberal common sense cannot simply abandon globalization, the ontological realities that it now represents. It is possible to interrogate further the neoliberal assumptions in which the hegemonic common sense has been framed of globalization, as a way of better understanding its effects and its discontents. The challenge before us is to explore ways of rescuing globalization from the clutches of neoliberalism, the question that keeps many of us awake, I am sure. Imagining a conception which is not wedded to its deeply ideological structure. But nor does it fall back into, as Trump and Brexit do, into dangerous nativism, into a common sense in which nativism, along with neoliberalism, is trying to define a globalization that is deeply, deeply contradictory, but deeply, deeply dangerous as well. For the danger with this kind of ethno-nationalism that Trump and Brexit advocate is that it's likely to produce a cultural politics that is based on a permanent state of fear, resentment, and conflict. But nor is it able to deliver the economic and social benefit that it falsely promises. An alternative to neoliberal globalization must begin with the realization of a paradox that, as David Held points out, the collective issues we must grapple with are of growing cross-border extensity and intensity. Yet the means of addressing these are local and national. Okay? It must recognize that the world is multipolar and that power exists in the world and that we are going to be pulled here and there everywhere, where some states are strong in almost all respects while others are not. The strongest states, such as the United States and Britain, even with their weakened conditions, are now tempted to go it alone and put themselves first. But the problem with this neoliberal logic of competition, the logic of competition is that in an increasingly interdependent world, this does not only harm the weaker state, but also the weaker members of weaker sections of the dominant, if we like, stronger states as well. In other words, it has a double banger effect. This suggests that while nation states retain their importance and will invariably pursue their own interests, this pursuit should become accompanied by an ethical outlook of care towards members of their communities, but of others as well. This demands a new rationality, a new way of defining and interacting and understanding interconnectivity, a new way of prescribing global exchange, a new way of defining interdependence. Interdependence is here to stay, the terms of which are still to be yet remain to be negotiated. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fazal. It's really a great privilege to be able to make some comments about your work. I was thinking whilst you were speaking that about 20... Sorry? I was thinking whilst you were speaking that I think about 20 years ago I walked into Leon Tickley's office in Birmingham, the University of Birmingham, and started a master's program, and I think that was the first time I got introduced to the ideas of globalization and education, and later on joining the University of Bristol and working with Susan Robertson and Roger Dale. I feel like I had a privileged entry into what is a very interesting field, a very interesting SIG that we now have, and also a very interesting and I think quite promiscuous and curious field that isn't afraid of exploring different disciplines and the intersections between international relations and geography and sociology and politics. And also, it's also a serious field. I think that the globalization and education work that's done really tries to address some of those issues that really matter to people in the real world, issues around inequalities and public and private and many of the challenges that we face. So I feel, in a sense, happy that I can recognize all the references that you used in your text, and grateful for those that guided me. I think that my discussion is not a critique. What I think it is the beginning of a dialogue, and the dialogue, I think, has already begun, and begun through Will Brehm and the fantastic spaces that he's created over the last year, the many podcasts that have been broadcast, also the discussions that have been going on over the last few days around, you know, what is going on and where does the state fit in, and I hope that that carries on over the next years. So I think that I'm going to start the discussion with the question about the relationship between neoliberalism and authoritarianism and cultural conservatism, because there's a sense that a lot of the work that we have done over the years, for the last 20 odd years, has been about economic neoliberalism and the rolling back of the state in education and in broader society. And there is also a sense that punctuated periods of neoliberalism have been deeply conservative and authoritarian. They're not all Trudeau's. They're also Pinochet's and Thatcher's, who were deeply conservative in their outlook, deeply homophobic, deeply sexist. So I think that there is a continuity in the neoliberal project that maybe we haven't picked up. And I almost feel at the moment like there is a second rollback going on. You know, thinking about Jamie Peck's work on rolling back the state. And in a sense, we feel like the democratic state is being rolled back now. A lot of the gains of the civil rights movement from the 1960s are being rolled back. The right of transgender communities, gay communities, black communities, Muslim communities, all of these people are under attack at the moment. And so, in a sense, you kind of feel like this is the second coming of some of those. They're saying, like, we've done the economic, now we've moved on to the cultural. And actually, if you go to, and I don't advocate everybody to read this, but if you read the 2,000-page dossier that the Norwegian neo-Nazi Breivik released on the day when he carried out these massacres, he talked an awful lot in that about cultural Marxism, which had dominated our societies and brought in all these liberal ideas that we had to eliminate from societies and bring back. And it was a lot of the stuff that he was writing was about multiculturalism. A lot of it is public discourse now in many circles in the UK and the US. And so I think that there's something about that that is not, maybe is a contradiction, but I don't think it's precisely the way that you have explained that. And I think that the second thing I would like to say is that in a sense, the way that you present ethno-nationalism is as a kind of retreatist, nativist project. But it seems to me that it's also a global project. Because if you look at, for example, Nigel Farage's frequent visits to the US after Brexit, and the discovery over the last week of the amount of money that UKIP was getting from the US to support the Brexit campaign, there seems to be interconnections. Bannon apparently has been advising Nigel Farage, and Nigel Farage has now begun a career as a radio presenter in London as a part of this kind of cultural process of winning the debate for the right, you know. So, you know, this Gramscian debate that's gone on a bit in the sessions this week, I think is really pertinent. But we shouldn't think that the left is the only ones that are interested in Gramsci and building hegemony. The right is also. So I think there is an issue around a global project of nativism that has its links and has its broader objectives. I think that the third thing that leads me to is that, and this is a positive one, I think that Trump brings people together, brings a lot of subjects together in disliking Trump. So you've got a whole range of communities that are being persecuted now, and there is a potential to build a unified movement. But that needs a pedagogy that recognizes difference in unity, and how do you develop that? Because we've already seen that immediately after the Brexit, immediately after the Trump vote. We also had a kind of Trump march in London, women's march against Trump, similar to the one that was held in the US. And it ended up in 2 marches because it was led by white feminists who excluded black feminists from the organizing committee of the march, and it ended up in a split. And it was all around issues around who has the right to talk about the issue, who has the right to be included, and who has the right to be excluded. And I think that if you're going to build a movement now that is broad enough to start to challenge some of these issues, then we need a pedagogy of respect in the spaces that we organize in to help that. And I think that that's fundamentally an educational phenomenon. It's about trying to find the conditions under which people feel comfortable to come together and organize together and feel that their issues are being taken seriously and they're not just a vehicle for somebody else's objectives. So I think that that's important. And I think that the second thing around the cultural dimension and resistance is that it's a very educational thing. I think that this whole cultural rollback is penetrating the schools already. I was reading in the paper yesterday that there's an attempt by an Arkansas Republican to eliminate Howard Zinn's works from the from the curriculum. In the UK, we're being told in the national curriculum not to teach books from foreign authors, that we should be promoting English authors. So there is a real sense that teachers in universities, in schools, in kindergartens need to hold their ground and need to challenge a lot of these areas because the ground is moving very quickly under our feet and we can lose many more of these. And that's why I think that the whole challenge that I think we face in relation to that is that many people are kind of nostalgic for Tony Blair or Hillary Clinton, and the thing is that I don't think we fully analyze the fact that it was many of their politics that have produced the reason why the white working class communities in many parts of the world do not have any faith in their so-called representatives. In particular in the UK, we see Tony Blair having made millions, entering into Parliament and then leaving Parliament after having made millions. So it's little surprise that the left has little credibility. So I think that, you know, we're in a kind of period where the centre has kind of collapsed, and either you build an alternative and a more radical project, or I don't think that you can have much of a chance of building an alternative. And I think that the last point I wanted to raise, Fazal, was that there is a danger of the kind of focus on Brexit and what's going on in the US, of forgetting about the many other places around the world that are facing massive struggles and stress. Thousands of academics have lost their jobs in Turkey over the last year. People have been dismissed, people have been imprisoned. The situation in the Philippines, the situation in South Africa of students and the police violence. There is so many different things. So I think that we have to counter nativism with solidarity, international solidarity, as well as internal solidarity. And that means building those links and solidarities amongst our colleagues and engaging with them in those ways. So I think that, you know, there is a big potential of a range of things that we can do, both as an academic field, but also as a field of practice that many of us occupy as teachers, as education workers, as community activists, that we really need to move forward in. Thank you.
We are just about at we have maybe a minute or two left. I want to thank Professor Rizvi and Professor Novelli for his very stimulating comments. Is there anybody who has a burning question or a comment that they would like to make? Of course, we can continue this conversation after the session, but I want to at least provide a small opportunity in case there's someone who would like to pose a question or make a comment to Professor Rizvi. Becky?
I think populism actually can be on both sides, you know. So I made that point actually somewhere, but I agree that that Bernie factor was really quite an important one. But at the same time, you know, what is quite clear is the left was a little more fractured, you know, than it needed to be in order to capture the basically the dominant place.
First yourself, sir. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Fazal and Mario, for wonderful talks. I just wanted to ask, really, whether you feel we've been a bit oversimplistic in the way that we've so easily characterized globalization as neoliberal. And that going back to Stuart Hall, who you mentioned earlier, you know, the idea that there's always been this demonic coupling between, you know, authoritarian populism and market ideology. And it's actually a moment in that tension between those two different kinds of discourses that we're witnessing now. And that, isn't it linked also to empire? So I smuggled that question in as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I agree with you, absolutely. I mean, there have been a number of different ways in which global interconnectivity and interdependence have been defined, you know. But I think at the same time, it'll be silly not to say that the neoliberal conception of interconnectivity has become hegemonic and dominant. You know, it may not be at CIES, but out there it certainly is. You know, so I think we've got to recognize that that is the case, and that there is a struggle over meaning, if you like, which is the kind of way that Stuart Hall would have put it. You know, that of course we recognize that there is a dominant Thatcherite discourse that had become dominant, that he wrote against in his authoritarian populism and his politics of Thatcherism. You know, but at the same time, you know, he would say that that there are lots of different ways of organizing society, organizing social, thinking about social formation and social possibilities, you know. And I think It's not that these things are not available. It's not that Bernie and his discourse is not available. It's just that, this discourse in which it was able to suture, these different elements together needs to be understood in its own terms. And that's actually what I tried to do. Of course, in relation to, there are other countries who are doing similar kind of things, where they're trying to actually understand the relationship between globalization and the local, the national, if you like, and neoliberal differently. I think I'm increasingly, each time I go to India, see how things look so very different in terms of some of these politics, and even the form of populism and the form of authoritarianism that is practiced appears different to me, although I'm not as closely familiar with India anymore as many other scholars are, of course, at this conference, who probably can say much more. But, there are other, in South Africa too, that you're familiar with. Neoliberalism is presenting itself against that history of apartheid and the struggle against apartheid and the kind of missteps in anti-apartheid movements.
I think we had one more.
Sangeeta wants to.
Thank you.
What also really stuck with me, and these are also conversations we've been having, sort of the South Asian left, when you said, there's so much of this populist movement, populist right, is working through sentiment and emotion. It's not sort of, something that can work through rational argument, right, or counter through rational argument. So then the question is sort of on the left, to build a populist left, what kind of a narrative that, are we going to sort of marshal that can work at that level of sentiment and feeling? It's not, we can't sort of work at the level of rational evidence and data, or say why diversity or this is good, or why immigrants have not actually taken your jobs. All of that doesn't seem to work. So it's almost like, okay, where are we? It's both a conceptual, theoretical, and a political question.
That's a good point, except I would like to point out that I think if sentiment existed on its own without some element of rationality, then it won't be taken seriously, okay? In other words, sentiment on its own doesn't exist per se. If in the philosophical traditions, going back to David Hume, where he talked quite extensively about reason and emotions, he basically argued very strongly, in my view, that reason has some elements of sentiment guiding it and steering it, and the same happens the other way as well, So unless you have some kind of quasi-plausible common sense about describing the world, then you cannot simply work on sentiment on its own, independently of that analysis of the plausibility of the empirical, even if it's ideologically guided and ideologically steered.
So there's still hope for reason.
I hope so.
Sangeeta.
That's a sentiment.
Sangeeta.
And informed by reason.
Thank you, Fazal. I actually really, I was really impelled by the question, the idea of the pedagogy of respect, in building the spaces where everybody would feel comfortable to come in, to offer the counter-narrative and counter-movement. And so build on Fazal's talk, what are the pedagogical possibilities? And I think that you offer some at the end of the talk for us, CIES scholars, right? So what are the pedagogical possibilities for us, especially to build up on that pedagogy of respect?
One of the problems with pedagogy, especially rationalist pedagogy, that it works from principles to the empirical groundedness. I think we ought to do it the other way around, okay? In other words, we have to actually have a pedagogy in which we consider the actual lived experiences, and through which we understand the nature of the principles that we might want to espouse, rather than the other way around. We actually do it the wrong way. So basically, I think all of us are experiencing globalization and a level of cosmopolitization at a level that we don't reflect on, we don't think about where it's coming from, yet in our everyday life, there are examples after examples after examples. I think it's working from those examples, those vignettes, if you like, towards broader principles of ethic and care and respect, That is where we should be going, rather than establish or struggle to establish some generalized abstract notion of a Kantian categorical imperative of respect as a principle, but then that requires application regardless. So to me, what is important is steering what we are already experiencing with all its contradictions, with all its tensions, and see whether we can't work on our own lives and steer them towards it. There's an element of Freire in there, but not quite.
All right, since we are significantly over time, I'm going to cut it off here, but I want to thank Professor Rizvi for highlighting the contradictions and for Professor Novelli for suggesting some ways forward. So please join me in giving them a hand. Thank you.